everyone. It's very nice to be here today. So as Ximena mentioned, I'm joining from Montreal. It's very early in the morning here, so apologies if I'm a little bit sleepy. It's really a pleasure to be joined today by such an interesting and experienced speakers. So we are going to have, to briefly introduce the panel members, we're going to have Sofia Kyriazi, who's Associate Innovation Officer at UNHCR, Stuart Campo, who's the Data Responsibility Team Lead at the Center for Humanitarian Data in OCHA, and Robert Trigwell, who's the Analytical Knowledge and Output Unit Lead at IOM. So AI is a growing field in the humanitarian sector, as it is in all sectors, really. And as a very powerful technology, it's been used in many humanitarian projects, such as predicting the arrivals of refugees in camps, predicting the spread and severity of COVID-19, organizing more efficient camp logistics, and analyzing humanitarian needs quickly in new crises. Those are just a few examples because there's really a lot of experimenting right now in terms of how to use AI to really improve the effectiveness and efficiency of humanitarian aid. As we know, though, AI does have risks, particularly when it comes to threatening human rights, discrimination, stereotyping against certain groups, and propagating social inequalities. As a technology that makes predictions based on recognizing patterns, when there are errors in a humanitarian context, those can potentially have a negative effect on already vulnerable populations. So like any powerful technology, it requires regulation to ensure that we promote good uses while protecting the public from its risks. There are many current initiatives globally to promote safe and ethical AI, from the UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of AI, which were adopted by UN member states in December, to the draft EU regulation on AI, which was published for consideration in April. And there's so many different initiatives in between. The AI ethics ecosystem is rich with draft policies, frameworks, and recommendations that can protect human rights and promote good uses of AI. But we're still in the early days of AI regulation, and much work needs to be done to better understand and harness this technology. So in the humanitarian sector, several data scientists and data policy experts have begun working on ways in which AI can be safer for aid beneficiaries. So in this conversation, we're going to speak about some of these important and, for me, pioneering initiatives in the sector. We're also going to focus on a branch of AI that is very rarely discussed in humanitarian AI ethics because it's still new in the sector, and that is natural language processing, which involves analyzing text data such as social media, news articles, and reports instead of quantitative data to analyze the humanitarian crises. So I'm now going to give the floor to each panelist in turn for a short presentation on their work and how it relates to data science and ethics. And we'll move on afterwards to some questions from my part first. And at the end of the discussion, we'll be able to take some questions also from the audience. So why don't we start now with Sofia?
Thanks, Eleonore. So I'll start sharing my screen and the presentation. Okay. You see it in present mode, I'm going to assume.
Yeah. Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. So basically, I'm Sofia Kyriazi from the Innovation Service of UNHCR, doing data engineering and just helping the data team support with all of the challenges that the organization is facing and some ad hoc requests. So basically, I'm only going to focus here on the predictive analytics project called JETSON. It was an initiative that was started like 5 years ago. But I think it's important since it was one of the first initiatives that were dealing with forced displacement. This specifically had the focus on internal displacement, but also some border crossings from Somalia to Ethiopia. So on the first slide. Here we can see a little bit the situation in Toloado, Ethiopia. So basically the first image, the border there was hosting a population of 40,000 people. And then within just a very short amount of time, we saw a huge influx in arrivals in the emergency in July 2011. So, and then currently, for example, when we started the project, it was around 200,000 people. So it was a humanitarian, it is still a humanitarian crisis, and the need to know how many people to expect was really important. But another situation was also occurring in Somalia, where internally displaced people were also moving a lot from region to region. Somalia is separated into 18 regions, and you had arrivals and departures from each region, and they could be count of thousands for months. And then here we can see Rebecca was originally supposed to speak here. So we can see Rebecca here that went to the field and like talked to some of the refugees that were fleeing Somalia to Ethiopia. And from the interviews, you can see that the refugees, the voices were saying that they would used to sell all of their personal belongings and their goats before fleeing. So you can see a drop in prices before someone deciding to leave the region. So this was a trigger basically for displacement. And based on some assumptions that we had around like what we managed to collect from these voices, and also some data sets that were available and then also actually what the challenge from the operation was, so to know the number of arrivals per region. So that they know how to respond. Basically, we started the project with some assumptions, and then we took into consideration a little bit the methodologies that were developed around like flow of people in emergency situations. Here you can see the assumptions, and I'm not going to stay more in this slide. But basically, the idea of the recipe was to start by using anything available in terms of data. That's maybe like the prices, as we said, from the market, climate data, like rainfall, river levels, etc., and then do some analysis on those data sets. Use machine learning open source basically packages to create models and have this like window of predictions in the future. The experiment followed 1 month in advance, and then like 3 months, because that's what the operation wanted. But we didn't automate the full process. We just monitored each individual segment. Yeah, and then you can see in the end here, basically how the accuracy in different levels was. So basically we decided to give and lower and upper bound of predictions. And for some regions, you could see a good prediction estimation, as well as for other regions were a bit more unstable. You can see that in the right side that the curve was predicted a bit later than the actual influx in arrivals. So yeah, what is important to build such a project is like we try to combine data science with the innovation process. So like having a user-centered design, trying to collect the data and like remove the bias and try to have a little bit of more like clean understanding and representation of the reality. Yes, we work closely with team fields, and then we actually utilize different skills and partnerships that we had from private sector to academia to help us steer the research, to actually help us develop more and do some research on like parallel assumptions. So yeah, thank you. And this was Project Jetson. If someone is interested, they can use the links here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. So yes, as you mentioned, Project Jetson was really one of the early examples of predictive analytics in the sector. So I think we all started to hear about it in 2018. Thank you so much for presenting its evolution and the thought process that went behind it, because I think it definitely inspired a lot of the future data science work in this field. So now let's move on to Stuart.
Great. Thanks, Eleanor. Just making sure that my audio is okay. Perfect. Well, great to be here and great to be joining this discussion virtually, but sort of sending our regards to everybody in the room there in Switzerland. As Eleanor mentioned, I work with the OSHA Center for Humanitarian Data based in The Hague. And my team and I work on data responsibility, which we define as the safe, ethical, and effective management of data in humanitarian action. Given the focus of the panel today, I wanted to zoom in on that ethical component and share a bit about sort of how we think about this broadly at the sector-wide level, and then how that sort of relates more closely to the topic of the discussion here for data science and more specifically NLP and humanitarian action. So when we're talking about the ethical aspect of data responsibility, we really want to start with the basis that humanitarian ethics exists as a framework that is widely recognized in the sector. And while it's not specifically sort of defined against data activities yet, that's actually the work that's ongoing right now with our team and the partners that we're working with, we can still base our discussions such as this one on the humanitarian principles that have always informed humanitarian action. Often there is a conflict between the existing humanitarian principles and some of the more sort of forward-leaning Silicon Valley values and principles that often drive discussions of new technology. And it's important for us to establish this common foundation that if we're talking about data science in humanitarian action, the humanitarian principles apply. So if we start from that premise that we're really talking about principled work with data and work with data that aligns with the humanitarian principles, we then start to think about what that means from the different lenses of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, those being the first four core humanitarian principles. What we've done together with our partners over the past several years is elaborated a sector-wide framework to help apply these principles and other related concepts of ethical data management in humanitarian operations. So looking specifically at some of the issues that Sofia just mentioned in the context of Project Jetson, this involves doing data impact assessments to understand what the ethical risks and benefits might be of a data management activity, and designing different interventions to kind of mitigate those risks, but also make sure that there's space for deliberation. I think one key point, and it'll likely come out particularly as we get more deeply into the discussion of NLP, is that ethics is about deliberation. There are not hard and fast rules. So even if we recognize that we have the humanitarian principles and we have activities through which we can understand the ethical dilemmas that might arise in data management, there are no clear-cut approaches to say, in this type of scenario, it will always be this way or that way. And so that's really the challenge we face as a sector now, particularly when we recognize that in the area of data science, we're going to often be working with new partners, new experts, and domain specialists and people who may not be as familiar with the humanitarian approach broadly, so that we really need to have that discussion space open and be able to recognize how we're kind of grappling with different issues in different humanitarian settings, how we're almost establishing precedent as well in how we interpret some of these issues, and then how we make sure that we're consistently applying these different principles and frameworks to the different issues that might arise in data science activities. I think one final point to mention is that, of course, we're trying to look at this from the perspective of both the global and the hyper-local, right? So the principles are global and sort of sector-wide and need to be maintained at that level to make sure that humanitarian action is consistent across contexts. But the way in which different issues related to data science arise will vary from context to context. And even within one particular context, if we take Somalia again from Sofia's example, depending on which part of the country you're in or which part of the population you're dealing with, different risks will arise. So we need to recognize that, again, by creating that space for principled deliberation, recognizing the difference between the kind of global frameworks that we apply and the need to have that deliberative process to assess different ethical dimensions. And then finally, documenting and applying the ways in which we think about and mitigate ethical risks, that will start to create, I think, a more consistent way of approaching ethical data science in the sector. And that's what we and our partners are really trying to do. So excited to have this discussion today and also to hear from the audience, perhaps some suggestions that you all might have on improving deliberation on ethical issues that arise in data and how humanitarians might work with other specialists to sort of think about this more effectively. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. Some really good points, and I think it's interesting to frame this as, you know, what you said about ethics being about deliberation. I think that really highlights the current and multiple conversations that are being had about AI ethics generally, and helps to kind of justify why we have such a need to discuss it in order to better be able to generate frameworks and even legal norms down the line. Okay, so now let's move on to Robert.
Good morning, colleagues, and yeah, a warm welcome to everyone in the audience, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Just firstly, I would definitely agree with Eleanor that I think the UNHCR Jetson project was definitely one of the first kind of big ideas on predictive analytics, and I definitely internally make reference to it as one of the kind of key kickoffs on this discussion for sure. Just to get going, so my name is Rob. I work for the UN Migration Agency, IOM, and more specifically, I'm part of the new Global Data Institute within IOM, where the displacement tracking matrix team is set. So just before I get going, kind of some reflections on how I see how this discussion's changed over the last 12 years is that, and that's the time I've been in the sector, is that basically 12 years ago, kind of data availability was very different how it looks now. The appetite for data is much more agencies are collecting more and more data. Agencies are better trained. There's more tools to ensure better data integrity and data quality. There's more ways to share data, such as OCHA's Humanitarian Data Exchange, the UNHCR platforms. There's a plethora of different platforms to kind of get accessible data, and it's more interoperable. So you've got initiatives like the Humanitarian Exchange Language. You've got the common operation data sets with the different kind of reference and geographic reference systems. So basically, we're in a situation now where there's a lot more better structured, accessible data, which is great. It's been a team effort from everyone involved, and it just shows the progressions and the innovations that we're dealing with. There's what the DTM team does specifically is that, for those that do not know, part of our portfolio is to collect actionable information in internal displacement contexts, so location of displacement sites, displacement of host communities hosting kind of displaced persons, so essentially geo-referencing populations, quantifying populations, quantifying number of displacement sites, basic needs and intentions. So camp management colleagues may know how many collective centres may need support, or where the vulnerable populations are at. So we're trying to collect actionable information and go into what I just said earlier, that is also openly available. That's a bit of a seesaw in terms of balance, because the more actionable the data you get for targeting, the more the way the data can be misused. For example, so I'm currently in Ukraine. The IDP numbers for the country is 6.5 million. That's at national level. That's a fairly safe number to publish. If we started to publish the location sites of each location across the country, then the sensitivity of that data, how you access it, should it be open or should it be accessible? And there is a clear difference. And these type of kind of ethical discussions kind of meander into the DTM's thought processes, which is partly why I'm probably here today. And another kind of angle from IOM's DTM is that we're a primary data collection tool. We collect information on displacement locations in Tigray, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Nigeria, and many other contexts. Also after natural disasters like in Mozambique and Nepal, and sometimes access isn't possible for a number of different reasons. So we explore different technological aspects to fill in the data gaps, because often on a map, if you were mapping IDPs across the country and there was no IDPs in a certain area, for someone who maybe not be too familiar with the analysis, it may show there's no IDPs there. If I was to read that, or if it probably says it means that we can't get there, which probably means there's greater need than there is. So we have to always try and fill this, and the explanation of the data from a responsibility perspective is just as important as the data itself. So like, there is nobody there, and this is why there is not. And so we try and fill in the gaps with satellite imagery to shelter detection, if that's possible, or we look at call detail records. Everyone moving has one of these. and in a situation where and monitoring kind of aggregated phone movements when that's possible. We try and do that, or new methods. And I really like the fact that Stuart said in this domain with kind of big data and analysis, there's new partners. Because, for example, in Ukraine right now, we're trying to understand internal movements. There's a few challenges to data collection here. So we're partnering with partners we've never worked with before, such as the Leverhulme Center for Demography, to understand changes in daily active usership of Facebook, to understand how Facebook is dropping in one area and popping up in another area, but taking into considerations challenges like certain cities have had no electricity since March 11th. So it's the kind of, it's how and when you would use certain technologies. That method I've just suggested there may be completely inappropriate in northern Myanmar, where I used to work, where ICT infrastructure and kind of 3G penetration is was extremely low. And then so kind of making actionable data using new methods. Obviously, the more kind of we interrogate the data, the more kind of the ethics of that comes in. And so I've had the pleasure to work with colleagues online before. I think I'll stop there and go on to action. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing that. I think one of the points that's really interesting that you made is the importance of really understanding what's going on in the field in order to better protect data and protect aid beneficiaries. You mentioned a lot, internally displaced persons, which is a key issue in this work in the humanitarian sector, is the vulnerability of the beneficiaries of AI systems, which is quite unique, in fact. And that's one of the issues with this gap in understanding between typical AI developers, which might be quite removed from the subject matter, and actually understanding all the nuances and the granularities of different crises, which is really critical in terms of being able to implement ethical AI. So I think I'm going to follow up right away with a question for you, Robert. So where do you see, as working with IOM, where do you see the work of IOM going in this space in the future, either at an operational level or from a data responsibility perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say it's kind of twofold. I would say in terms of like the more kind of newer, innovative ways to obtain data is so that stream there is the operations. So what I mean by that is that a classic DTM mission, let's just say in northern Mozambique right now, near Cabo Delgado, we will be collecting information on kind of displacement sites, locations, movements, just to inform operations of our partners on the ground, or something similar in a number of other contexts that DTM works at. So one way we're kind of looking at kind of AI systems is as part of our quality control. So often we work in areas that are quite where there's a bit of a data vacuum. If you would compare these kind of contexts to say like the UK, where there's 1 million of data sets, often there's not a huge amount of data sets to about. So we basically, in certain contexts, we basically will forecast what movement may be based on independently of what we're doing ourselves collecting, and then use that as a second triangulation source to essentially triangulate from. So we run models to basically provide as secondary sources, and we rarely publish that, but we would say, okay, from what we're collecting in Nigeria about displacement over the last 5 years, we're capturing seasonal trends. We know when there's the rainy season, we know when people move and when people don't based on our historical data sets. So therefore, for the next couple of months, we're expecting to see this. And then we'll essentially run a similar model to do that, to align. And then that will help us. So if we're on track, then great, but we actually go out and collect it anyway. Or if there's a big difference for whatever reason, then we have a system where that gets flagged. So to basically check upon like, okay, why are we lower? Is it because there's been a massive flood earlier in the season that has displaced people, or is it because access, which means that people aren't moving? So we use these systems as an internal quality control tool. And secondly, if you were to go onto the Humanitarian Data Exchange website and click on IOM's DTM, you would get a gazillion different data sets on DTM displacement locations for a number of different contexts. And this is where, say, the work that we this triggered some interest a couple of years ago, because we hosted an event on forecasting, and our data set was, well, we've seen more and more, but our data set pop up in more and more different places. People looking at displacement context in, say, northern Ethiopia, but elsewhere. So we developed a kind of ethics project with a number of different stakeholders about, okay, once the data is in the big wide world, what are some of the ethical considerations that people should be thinking about of how to use the humanitarian data? And this goes back to the comment that Stuart made about new partners, is that we get contacted a lot about well-intentioned students or research groups predicting movement, but those people may come from a different discipline, from a computer science discipline, from a physics discipline. They may not be aware that if you were to predict movement from destination A to destination B, and you expose that to quite a detailed route, you could be exposing movement across an international border. You could be exposing routes that could be expose people moving and heighten their risks. So as a community is talking about, okay, if you are going to use data science and methods for humanitarian purposes, it's not just about having the perfect model. It's about having the perfect. It's about the ethical considerations about the publications, about the use as well, and the exposures to the populations. So the answer is twofold. I think I've gone over my time a little bit as well, so apologies.
No, thank you so much, and that was really interesting. So for those that are interested, there is an output of the data science and ethics group. Can you just mention quickly how people might be able to access information about this?
Yeah, so the tool was developed initially based on the rationale that I just mentioned, and it's basically a tool that if you're a humanitarian team that is developing a new data science team, or if you're a data science team trying to enter the humanitarian space, there's like a decision tree, and it's not perfect because different people have different processes, but it was developed from humanitarian partners right through to colleagues at Amazon AWS and Alan Turing Institute. And it was basically the problem recognition. So I'm a big believer in that for any humanitarian problem, it's we understand the problem. And then the second step is understanding the solution. Is the solution something that can be automated, something that can be enhanced with an AI tool? Or is it something that cannot? Let's not start with, I can build a model for X. Let me try and plug a square box into a round hole. Let's have full ownership over what the problem is. And then the tool goes through a number of different steps to do with kind of algorithms, data quality, and output communication. So it's like a very multifaceted tool. I can share the link, but it's really, it's not a standard, because who are we to say that? But it's really like, if you're going to, we originally designed it for our DTM colleagues, but then we realized that many different people were having similar approaches. We spoke to some innovation funds, and they were like, we're getting a ton of people doing data science projects that may not necessarily understand the principles that Stuart mentioned again. So it's really the kind of like, these are the considerations you should think about when you're trying to do a data science enhanced humanitarian project.
Thank you. And I think that this project illustrates an interesting phenomenon in AI ethics in the humanitarian sector, is that the initiatives currently are what I would call grassroots initiatives. So data scientists working in the field have started to identify certain issues and risks, and have in and of themselves started to develop solutions for those risks. So while we wait for maybe more high-level regulations or normative frameworks in the field, data science themselves are starting to address some of the risks and the gaps that they find. And I find that very common in the humanitarian sector and really interesting. So I'll move on for a question with a question for Sofia. So in the JESN project that you described to us, you mentioned the goat story, which I think is a story that's really interesting, that certain important indicators arise when doing field research that might not necessarily exist, or data scientists might not be aware of when they're working from their desks and from their offices. And I was wondering, that was an important lesson learned during the development of the Jetson project. And I was wondering if you have any other lessons that you learned during this project and that you might be applying in potentially other data science projects in the field.
Yeah, so that basically was Rebecca. In that story, I think the approach was very decent for that time when we didn't have like a lot of context-specific information. And I think that's what made the difference, kind of like basically create a really good representation of reality by having these indicators, by incorporating them into the models. But I think Project Jetson had, because I mean, I'm not trying to justify it, but it was one of the first initiatives, and we didn't have that much the decision-making tied into the idea of like how we approach the challenge. So because we are still working on other predictive projects, I can see how we take that into consideration when we are, let's say, engaging with the operation, when we see how they do the planning, how they do, so basically their decision-making process and their actions, their initiatives. We now take into consideration basically things around scenario building, how they approach key decisions when it comes to like relocations, like all of these different aspects and parameters that a camp holds or registration holds. So all of these processes that are tied to our operations are really important. And in parallel with any kind of like modeling that you're doing, is good to explore these processes because you can provide additional insights. So maybe these insights are actually more valuable than the predictions. And then you can always tie it to a prediction tool, but like engage the user also to have accountability towards the system and how they will use that data. Because you, as a scientist, let's say, and like I think also the other participant gave this point, shared this point with us, is that as a data scientist, you only consider one aspect. There are communities of practice that you can learn from. And then you also have the operation and you are learning the most out of them. So it's good to tie all of these things together and not act individually and like with a higher purpose of just like implementing a model and deploying something with high accuracy, or like these are not, they shouldn't be the goals and the objectives of the project. So we learned those things, and we learned that actually a lot of, like Rob was saying that they're using Facebook data. There are a lot of like alternative sources that you can use to cross-validate your ground truth. And that's very important as well. You cannot lean on one source of information, and that can create a lot of biases as well. And then I think, except for decision-making and like the data, I think we also learned a little bit to take into consideration that there might be gaps and there might be time like problems where you won't have feedback directly from different sources, or like, so the streaming of the data is like a little bit uncertain every time. So like always kind of model having like that caveat. So like if you can better prepare to avoid problematic models because you didn't take into consideration the harsh reality, which is that you will never have in like data at the right time at the right place. So yeah, I think that's a more technical though consideration, but yeah, and lesson learned. And I would say that a lot of the current predictive analytics projects are really tied to the users and not so independent. So maybe that's a shift that we're taking. And maybe we should also take a shift towards like more environment, or, but either way, the user approach, I think is benefiting us a lot.
Thank you. I think you brought up one of the important also points of ethics in the sector is the way in which these tools are incorporated into decision making. So bearing in mind that the objective of doing AI often, maybe not in every case, but it's to support the organizing and planning of humanitarian action. And so there's a thought process as well into how these predictions are incorporated, and there's a lot of different ways of doing it. And I think there's also a thought about what impact does having these predictions have on the decision making. So often we think about, for example, quantitative outputs or AI predictions as something that could potentially have a different kind of impact on the way people make decisions, as opposed to a suggestion or an analysis by an expert. So as people, we respond a certain way to AI, and sometimes we place additional importance on AI predictions. So I've seen this, for example, in the medical sector, where doctors can be supported by AI suggested diagnostics, and doctors have a tendency to put aside their own medical professional judgments when the AI has a different judgment than their own. And I find that that's an interesting kind of tension in this field, because as we've already discussed a lot, the AI predictions are one element of a lot of also field expertise and people that have a lot of experience and local populations and contextual information that is also important to take into consideration. So that's kind of an important element here, is to think about the role of AI in decision support in these complex contexts. So I have a question now for Stuart. So you spoke about several initiatives at the Center for Humanitarian Data, and notably the data responsibility guidelines that you developed. I was wondering if you could tell us more about this, how this document is being implemented in the humanitarian sector.
Sure, thanks, Eleonore. And maybe just to mention one other important framework for the sector, something that Rob and the team at IOM, as well as colleagues of Sofia's from UNHCR and many other organizations have been involved in, because it's more sort of broadly the framework that we can ground these discussions in. So last February, just over a year ago now, we had the Iasc operational guidance on data responsibility endorsed. And what this document offers is a framework for different types of actions at different levels of humanitarian response to support data responsibility broadly. As I mentioned earlier, this of course includes the ethical dimension. So starting from understanding the data ecosystem within which you're operating and what some of the different ethical considerations might be, through to more specific sort of data management activity level considerations. How do I get the data that I need? You know, as Sofia mentioned, what type of agreements do I need to have in place? This might be the point where you could use the tool that Rob mentioned, the decision tree, for different decisions around how you design and develop a model in humanitarian action, right through to destroying the data, which actually in the context of AI is really important and often not something that we anticipate. Then looking beyond the specific activities, thinking more about how over the longer term, we're creating a more responsible humanitarian data environment. And that's, I think, where we, as we start to think about bigger data, more data, and a wider variety of actors, it's really important to be thinking about how these frameworks can continue to guide us. So specifically in terms of the Iasc framework and then the OCHA guidelines, which really are just a more descriptive sort of instruction for OCHA staff on how to implement the Iasc guidance. There are a few different ways in which this is particularly relevant to NLP, or really modeling more broadly in the sector. So one would be at the beginning of any project, as I mentioned earlier, doing a data impact assessment and really trying to understand what the different positive and negative potential impacts are of a model being developed, or perhaps leveraging different models, to your point, Eleonore, around how we think about what decision makers will do with the outputs of models and how that will influence the way that they decide to allocate resources or decide to go into one particular location or another. And doing that assessment up front is something that honestly has not been consistent in the sector. It's not something that is necessarily required in many organizations. More organizations now have data protection impact assessments as a requirement. And of course, personal data protection is fundamental to ethical work with data in the sector. But we also need to make sure, particularly in the types of data that we're thinking about here, that non-personal sensitive data is considered in those contexts. So even after we anonymize data, which most of the time in modeling projects, the data will be anonymized to a certain level, It can often be re-identifiable, which presents its own risks, but also even if it's not re-identifiable to the individual level, we have to think about the risks to different demographic groups. So even if you've moved sort of beyond all of the personal data risks, often in this type of work, we're thinking more about the risks to groups or demographic sort of sub-cohorts that we often can't assess in the sort of data protection specific lens. So this type of approach recommended in the guidelines will help us think about identifying those impacts and then taking mitigation measures to address them. I think one other key piece here, and sort of then shifting to the other side of the center's work on this front, which is our peer review framework, is thinking about how these issues are not one-off considerations that then sort of go away at the end of a project. This is a constant process of thinking through the different implications of work with data, particularly data science and decision making in the sector, and then continuing to keep an eye on the broader environment. What other data might be available? You know, what risks might come together if the outputs of a model are brought together with other data sets that in isolation don't reveal anything, but then when brought together could create sort of pathways to harm, targeting, or other risks that we might want to mitigate, right? So in the context of our predictive analytics program, and I'll just quickly mention to anyone who's actually there in person at the conference that my colleague Leonardo is somewhere, he might even be in the room, beauty of a hybrid event. And if you want to learn more about the center's work on predictive analytics or specifically the peer review process, which I'll very quickly describe now, then find him for a coffee after this session. So one key element of the center's peer review framework and the process that we are leading on this is the ethical assessment of a model. What we will look at here, and we can also make sure to share the framework after this event on Twitter, is a series of considerations around how different models might impact different stakeholder groups in the context where the models are being used. So we take a pretty systematic approach to this. We have within the framework an ethical review matrix that our reviewers fill out, and then ultimately we bring that together in a bit of a synthesis for a discussion with the model owner or the organization that's led the development to then identify, we'll first make sure that they sort of agree with the deliberation and then identify mitigation measures that they might take. So it's a series of simple questions which are not as simple to answer, and I'll just run through them quickly, and then Eleonore, I'll hand back over to you perhaps to sort of use that as a basis for the next part of the discussion. But basically what we want to look at when we're thinking about ethical data science in the sector is what are the parameters that actually limit a particular model or data project? Who's affected by the intended use of this model and the decisions that might be made by its outputs? Then for each of the specific stakeholder groups, sort of what are the potential issues? And this, I think, particularly interesting in our context is accuracy, issues with the data, overreaction to an output and sort of decisions that could be taken, false positives or false negatives, and sort of what the knock-on effects of those are. So thinking about those different issues and how they manifest for different stakeholder groups, and then ultimately how we can mitigate those to make sure that the model is used to improve the delivery of assistance without putting people at greater risk. So that was a pretty whistle-stop tour of some of the ways in which we can use these different tools and frameworks for more ethical work with AI and data management broadly in the sector. Happy to go into more detail and also to hear what others think about this.
Thank you, Stuart. And it's good to start unpacking a little bit the different elements to take into consideration when thinking about ethics in when you're developing a model. So there's a technical component to it too. And that's what we're starting to see in some of the more detailed regulatory proposals, like for the one proposed in April by the European Union is really has a very detailed certification process. And I think that echoes what you mentioned about the peer review framework and what Robert spoke about as well with the decision tree, is that there's actually a need to go into quite a lot of detail into the models, the proposed impacts, how it's going to be used, what kind of data is used, and so on. And so for me, you can start paralleling in a way to some of potentially work that could go into a different kind of technology, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, where when you make a medication and release it to the public, could have a lot of positive impact. But at the same time, if it's unregulated, it's very, very risky. And so you have to really do so many things in order to make some a drug safe for the public, right? You have to do clinical trials and you have to document everything that goes into it and so on and so on. So you see that a lot with AI in that you have to really have a very comprehensive approach to these AI models in order to minimize the risks. And you just kind of dropped one thing into here, which I think is important to highlight, is the issue of the destruction of the data. So, and I think that I just want to bring it up again, because I think that predictions in this kind of context can have a really big impact. So as we mentioned, if we're predicting, for example, how many people would arrive in a refugee camp or something like that in a highly, in a complex situation, in a conflict setting, for example, what impact could that have on people being targeted or vulnerable people in particular to be put at risk, maybe unaccompanied children, for example. There's a lot of considerations as well. And I think that's something that we haven't discussed so much in the past, is what to do with these predictions after they're done. Is there a way to really kind of more streamline the destruction of the data in order to make sure that these things are not kind of staying and floating around and potentially contributing to the vulnerability of people. So I'm going to move on to open question for all the panelists. So what I would suggest is just to raise your hand, basically, if you want to answer. And so we'll ask this question, and then I think after your answers, I will move on to audience questions. So we spoke about AI more generally during this panel, but I wanted to bring the conversation a little bit to natural language processing initiatives in the humanitarian sector. And I was wondering, from your perspective, are there differences between ethical approaches to quantitative data science or data management and approaches with text-based or qualitative data? And if so, could you mention them and discuss it in a little bit more detail? So you can just, you can go ahead.
Okay. Just
go
take
ahead,
the mic. Yeah. So, I mean, from what we have seen, definitely text occupies a lot of the data sets that we have available. But since qualitative data is mostly around text and collected by humans, and we usually have consent forms, and there are other ways now to have consent forms, such as saying exactly what you don't want to be shared, which is a great way of giving actually consent. And then anyways, we have this representation that is also important in text. So it can hide a bit of a bias. Let's say it's not the same as using sensors to show temperature somewhere. So you have this kind of different set, and it affects the analysis because also on a technical level, when you're processing text, you kind of need to set up what quantitative measures you will extract from there. So I think you can start thinking a little bit of the risks there and the mechanisms that you can start detecting all of the propagated bias in the data, same as you do with the other quantitative data. But also you can understand a little bit the layers that come from using, for example, pre-trained NLP models, such as we were seeing in the previous presentation. I think it was Nick that was giving that they have built this curated library for humanitarian, a model basically like BERT, but with humanitarian text pre-trained. So you can take a little bit the considerations of what kind of different types of analysis you need to apply on when you're performing NLP, but also where the data is coming from and who gave consent and what representation you have, to summarize. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Sure, Eleanor, just quickly, I mean, I think one issue that we've seen more on the HDX side of things, so sort of quality assurance and review of data that partners are sharing for open access, is that with qualitative data, it's of course harder to assess the sensitivity. There are fewer clear and automated ways to assess consistently sensitivity of this data over time. And so often, especially in free text data, our data managers are looking through, sometimes for hours on end to make sure that in unstructured data of that type, there aren't identifiable details or details about a particular incident that could, in context, help re-identify an individual or a group. And so I think that's one thing for us to keep in mind, is that even as the technology for processing qualitative data evolves, it's still going to be difficult to make sure that we're precisely and comprehensively identifying sensitive data elements, and then either removing them or transforming them in a way that then makes it safe to share, or even just ingest that model into, or the data into a model as part of the sort of farther forecasting work.
And just on my side, to complement what colleagues have already said, I mean, in terms of the ethics, I would say a lot of it comes back to what is the problem we're trying to achieve and what's the appropriate solution for it. So what would be the impact of the work? Some of the examples that Stuart mentioned. So I think a lot of the kind of like the baseline ethics are actually the same. Like what are we trying to achieve? Like what's the big problem at hand, and what are we trying to achieve? Just from a real life example, IOM, we lean much more on the kind of quantitative side than the qualitative side. However, during the COVID, we were monitoring mobility restrictions, and being the UN Migration Agency, we were looking at how various kind of country-imposed mobility restrictions were leading to kind of like stranded migrants. So what I mean by that is, if country A imposed restriction on country B, and there was nationals of country A and country B, how do they get home? We saw this a lot with students, we saw this with different kind of migrant groups. So there wasn't very much quantitative information on this, particularly because most countries were in lockdowns. There was very little ways to get that. A lot of the time they were undocumented, so we couldn't kind of do phone surveys. So we developed a tool with AWS about kind of scraping as much media sources as we could get, about kind of migrants, COVID, restriction. We had a number of keywords from a number of key media sources. But one thing we definitely noticed on this, and this would kind of be turned into a qualitative report because the lack of statistics, but was really about, we really noticed that we needed someone to, it helped us channel our information source, but it didn't get us to the final piece. And we actually had two protection officers who their job was to essentially translate to get the kind of the bit from the funnel here to the final product, because as Stuart just mentioned, there was a lot of kind of background contextual understanding on how the narratives report, and if you typed in kind of like trapped migrant COVID, there was actually a lot of kind of like anti-migrant rhetoric from some key categories that you would assume would highlight kind of protection concerns to migrants. So it was in that step where we just really, we need people here. Maybe other organizations do have the systems equipped to kind of more refine, pick that up. We do not. So we actually just put like people at the center. People put people at the stage to kind of essentially read it, and then they did the kind of the translation into the qualitative report ourselves. Kind of just summarise it. It's very much hard to pick up on the qualitative kind of sensitivities without kind of reading. You can pick up just if the headline says this, it doesn't mean the report is saying that. And if we're quoting stuff, you need to make sure that it's not kind of like an anti-migrant rhetoric in a kind of when we're trying to expose the protection issues of migrants.
Thank you all for your responses. I think the issue of sensitivity is very unique to the humanitarian sector in general, but particularly in this case. And Sofia also mentioned bias in data. And I just wanted to bring up one issue that's very specific to NLP in this context and generally is its reliance on language models that might be trained on different kinds of data. And so language models could be used to extract relevant information from data and turn it from qualitative data and turn it into quantitative data, or even generate text. So potentially summarizing different larger documents, or even maybe interacting with aid beneficiaries in the form of a chatbot, for example. There's different ways in which natural language could be generated in this context. And one of the things to really think about is the risks in terms of biases to specific groups when this language is extracted or when it's generated. So there's been a lot of documentations, for example, in terms of gender biases, either discrimination or stereotyping based on gender. There's also been some cases of racial biases as well. So when we're working with a lot of different kinds of populations in this field, it's important to keep in mind all of these different biases that could arise and make sure to address them. Because I think that the risk of having discrimination or stereotyping in the models that are used could have a really negative impact on, for example, IDPs or refugees and so on. So I wanted to thank everyone for their really interesting contributions. What I'd like to do now is to give the opportunity to the audience to ask any questions, and also to let us know if you have any suggestions in terms of future initiatives or work in the field. So a lot of the work that's been described today has really been, again, grassroots initiatives in data scientists and data professionals thinking through some of these issues in a lot of detail and trying to come up with solution. So my question to the audience is, what do you think is next in terms of our work in the field? Do you have any suggestions in terms of where we could turn next? And I'll leave it to Ximena to manage the audience questions a little bit.
I'll go first over here.
Thank you for pointing out the bias. So it's actually something we have been working on to measure and trying to mitigate this bias in word embeddings and other language models as transformers. So from a research or technical perspective, we do not have a solution right now for that. So maybe you can elaborate a bit more on how we can handle this in practice. So, okay, are there processes we can build around application using such word embeddings or models, or how can we deal with that? As I guess I would say we would not have a solution or complete tool to debias these word embeddings in the near future.
Thank you. So the question was, in terms of biases in natural language models, what could be potential solutions or processes that could be used that could debias these models? Is that a good summary of the question?
Yes, that's fine.
Does anyone here want to take that question? So I can give a few comments from my perspective, and then if anybody wants to jump in, please feel free. So as a data scientist, what I feel is that there's a risk to using pre-trained models in, for example, BERT or other such tools. And I think that an important thing to consider is pre-trained models allow us to make predictions more quickly. And it takes a lot of effort to train a language model and to find even data. But I think that having high quality and balanced data to start and then train a model, it would go a long way into reducing risks in terms of biases for different groups. And it seems obvious, I think, for people who work in the field, but I would say that because often these kinds of tools are developed in a kind of emergency setting, and I don't mean so much because it's a humanitarian crisis, but because there's maybe a pressure to deliver very quickly, the teams are very lean, there's not a lot of funding and so on, there could be a tendency to use pre-trained models that might have been trained on something like a Google corpus or Wikipedia or something, where the biases of the data are very prevalent. And so those kinds of available corpuses have so many biases in them. And so I think that one of the things to really take into account is the way in which the natural languages are trained, models are trained in a way that would be appropriate for the humanitarian sector. And I think that's a kind of technical solution that would probably go a long way. And then in discussion, in relation to what everybody has spoken about, in the process of developing balanced training data, there would be a whole element of understanding and speaking to different stakeholders, understanding the context, and having a sort of qualitative analysis to identify key groups in the data and just make sure that they're being treated in an appropriate way.
Yeah, just to add to that from my side, so I'm coming at this not from a kind of data science perspective. I'm coming at this from like I helped support set up DTM operations, but in terms of kind of data bias, I mean, there's always a backstory to data. There's always a backstory to how it's collected. Saying you're going to go with zero bias data, I think is shooting for the stars. So I think it's all about being realistic, and I think transparency. So I mean, we as a sector. I mean, my kind of take on this is that a lot of the agencies kind of are out collecting humanitarian data per se. In the field, needs assessments, locations of collective centers, IDP sites, whatever, food security assessments. We kind of have our way that we analyze our data. We make it all available on HDX. There's the humanitarian needs overview. There's new initiatives, don't get me wrong, but they're not like, I think it's safe to say the vast majority of them is not super technical in terms of super detailed analysis. Where you see that is often by the outside world. The academic groups, the think tanks, the people that look at super detailed analysis. I get messaged twice a day on, can you explain this data set to me, for example, for DTM, particularly in Ukraine. So I think one thing we need to be better at, and we as DTM and other, is that when we make data publicly available on HDX, we explain the backstory of it. So I mentioned earlier, if we're providing internal displacement locations over Ethiopia, and we do not have any IDP locations in one particular region for Ethiopia, to someone who's just looking at it and plotting it on a map, it could look like there's no internal displacement. That's going to bias your analysis or whatever. It's probably because we don't have the government permission to operate there, or we couldn't operate there because of floods or conflict. So I think one thing we need to be better is that we need to essentially publish methodologies just as commonly as we publish the data sets. And, and also if any output models have gone through peer review, like the one that the Ocha team have set up, then it kind of document that process as well. I think the story of how we get to the shiny graph or the shiny map on a page is just as important as the data set itself. And we're getting better at it. We still kind of suck at it, to be honest. And a lot of that misinterpretation of data, I thought this column meant this, but it actually means that. That feeds into a lot of the misinterpretation. And just one more thing on that is also, it's not just about making models. It's about making models, testing them, ground truthing them, iterating them, doing the same. Like if we say there's going to be a movement of people because of the droughts in Somalia, I picked Somalia. That wasn't because of Jetson. That was because there's a drought in Somalia at the moment. And we say this many people are going to be displaced, or this many going to be people affected. Okay, well, then we should really test that. And then when the same model gets produced the following year or the following El Nino, etc., was the model that we implemented last year or 3 years ago, was it actually correct? Or are we just going to basically copy and paste it to other contexts? So I think the data that goes into it and explaining what this means, as I said, because a lot of the people processing it may not be as familiar to how it's collected on the ground, the methodologies, the difference between the key informant interview, the difference between a household, the difference between a focus group discussion, the difference between direct observation. And then also, okay, we've made all these fancy models for how, I don't know, cholera is going to spread in country X. Was it right? Why wasn't it right? Okay, how do we change the parameters to make it more accurate? Are we discussing with the Ministry of Health on the ground? Are we discussing with the WHO in that particular circumstance? Let's iterate it, let's make it smaller. And I would suggest, and also get your data public online, because if I do analysis and I'm saying that this is the situation, I would hope that if someone from Stuart's team or someone from Sofia's team was to do the same analysis, they would come up with the same results. So like also making the data sets transparent. And so there's I can never say this word. There's a reproducibility to the findings. And I think that's key. There's a lot of making shiny reports. There's not that much, hey, try and make the same shiny report. If you come up with the same answer, sweet, we're pretty good. And that's what I meant earlier about the triangulation. Is like looking for secondary data points to always triangulate, looking at different methods to try and come with the same answer. And if we're in the same ballpark, it's pretty good. But in terms of eliminating bias, we're never going to get there because data is not neutral, and neither is the operating environments that we work in. And that's something that should be quite clear, is that a lot of decisions are not based on data. I used to work for DFID, now FCDO, which is the donor. A donor is a political organization. They're going to make decisions based on things for them. Like they're not going to exclusively distribute aid here because the data set says there. There may be factors that come into this, and I think we as analyst providers rather than data providers should be aware of that. That we work within we always hear data for decision making, but we often don't take into consideration that we're not working in political vacuums. And the data we produce, you can have great decisions on great data. You can have great decisions on bad data. You can have bad decisions on good data. And we have to be aware of that. So we have to so if someone's going to look at, maybe someone at the FCDO or whatever, a donor is going to make a decision on allocating funds to a certain country or a certain part of the country or a certain thematic area based on one number, they have to know how that one number was produced in quite a simple way that a non-technical person can understand. And I think without that, you kind of like, oh, this was made by an AI model, it must be correct. I don't necessarily think that's right. So there's ethics in how we present everything and how we share stuff.
Thanks, Robert. And you brought up a lot of really, really important points. One thing that comes up for me a lot in hearing you speak is the phrase technological solutionism. And in the sense that we all really see the possible value in AI and its power. But I think that the general idea here is that there needs to be a slowing down a bit of the process of developing these models in order to give time for appropriate oversight and analysis and communication also of possible errors to decision makers. So there's all kinds of things that need to happen. And I think that that's replicated kind of in the whole AI field, in that as we increase in regulation and frameworks in order to operate in a more safe way, we're not going to just quickly be able to create, as data scientists, a model quickly on your laptop and it runs, in 24 hours later, it's being used in the public. And to be honest, that's kind of how a lot of data science has been done in the last 10 years. And so now we're moving towards a different paradigm, I think, for data science more generally, where it's going to be a little bit slower and a little bit more thoughtful. And that, I don't see this as a bad thing necessarily, but it will definitely change the way data scientists think and operate. Are there any other questions from the audience?
Questions? We've got one more, Eleanor. See, this is good. She'll type the question too. Oh.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you hear me there?
I think they can.
Yes.
Let me just, because I think the microphone is the laptop microphone here.
Yeah, you can come here then.
Yeah. Is it better here?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Let me just see that. There's a microphone. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm Navid Rekabsaz. I'm from Johannes Kepler University, Linz. This is a super interesting discussion. Thank you very much. This is also very interesting for me because the research in my group is focused on fairness and bias in NLP, particularly on deep learning models. And seeing that from this perspective is really interesting for me. I wanted to first of all, like a little talk about the solution that we were talking here from my point of view. So I heard a lot about documentation, the framework that's designed here, this decision tree. It's super interesting. I really want to see how we can really implement that also in practice. That's also an interesting question here, to know a little more about the detail of that. I should also say that in my opinion, the solution that we are talking here are all imperfect. So we should kind of also mention that these are also, none of them are like the golden key that we can really solve this problem, because apparently the problem is much bigger than that and much more complicated. For example, even if we audit data, even if we look through all the text that we are processing here, and then we push it into this pipeline of transformers and machine learning and deep learning, then some patterns get occurred and get found in this data that we have never thought about it as humans. So we actually never know what's happening inside of this thing, and whether something good or bad is happening there. A part of that is in our control, but really a part of that we should confess that is not in our control. So we should kind of see that auditing is perfect, having this decision tree, this qualitative view is perfect, but it's imperfect. It's good, but it's imperfect. So it's a part of that we should consider. And just to have a little of positive words, I mean, I'm going to also say a little story about something that is quite similar, but it's a little different, and it's about whole the software engineering process that went through a very similar story, although it's slightly different. So back in time when I was a teenager 100 years ago and do programming, that time we just do programming. I'm talking about what Eleonore said as slowing down. So at the time we were not slowing down. We were just coding, that if you look at the code now, you definitely call it the spaghetti code, but at the time we were thinking about it's a golden code. Nothing can be better than that. So something that happened during software engineering after a rocket exploded because of a software, or 2000 panic because the software was wrong and everything was going down. Everybody felt that there should be a different way of handling this very important part of our society. And then comes a couple of tools that developed during this time. Some of them are documentation, as we are now talking about documentation of AI. Some of the tools are qualitative, that we look at the system in a qualitative manner, but some of the tools are also quantitative, and they are also automatic, like automatic testing, et cetera, et cetera. So these are a couple of tools together that try to solve a very hard problem. And now that we are talking about AI, maybe we also need a set of different tools that are all of them individually are imperfect, but the combination of them might be something that would help us take a step into challenging this problem. So something that I want to hear your opinion about that. We've talked a lot about, let's say, qualitative manners and documentation, etc. But as we are doing also very often, there are also automatic ways. For example, let's say if you have a language model, if you have a set of transformers, we can train another attacker, that is attacker try to see whether gender can be retrieved from the information that is encoded into this model, or race, et cetera, all of the protective attributes that could be different in different scenarios. So the question from the panel would be, how would you see the combination, how would you see the more automatic systems in order to show the problem or solve the problem, and how would you see these automatic approaches in combination to more qualitative, human-oriented approaches? Thank you.
Thank you for the really interesting question. Does anybody from the panel want to answer that? Yes, Stuart.
Sure. Thanks for the question. And I mean, I think there were a number of challenging things we could get into in your intervention, but just to focus on this automated versus more sort of manual human-led process question. In our sector, it should probably always be both for the foreseeable future. We should not be relegating or delegating, but effectively relegating decisions to automated systems at this point, if those decisions affect whether or not, and if so how, someone receives life-saving assistance. We're not ready for that. The data is not good enough. The systems are not powerful enough, and we don't have robust processes in place or sufficiently robust processes in place to make sure that those decisions can be audited and corrected in time. And I think it's fair to say there are no automated decision-making systems actively in use in ongoing crises at that level, at least, that are determining whether someone receives assistance. So it's often overstated the degree to which AI is actually being used in the sector, and I think it's important for us to recognize that as well. That being said, again, keeping this kind of balanced approach to automated processes to help clean data, to help make sure that some of the more labor-intensive aspects of modeling can be handled more efficiently and give us more time for that thoughtful design, use of or collection of inputs, use of outputs, and then critically the ethical deliberation piece that we've all touched on. That would be perhaps the way to think about this. So not either or, but both in different proportions, depending on where you are in the model development and deployment process. And then again, you know, it's early days for the sector, but it's not early days for these issues in other domains. So we can learn from other areas about how different processes for assessing and mitigating risk or identifying issues to address might be relevant to our sector. Keeping in mind that humanitarian data is distinct, it is patchier, it's not as big as the other data that in the health sector, for example, people are working with. And so tools will have less historical data to work with, and they will take longer to train well, right, to avoid some of the issues that the other panelists have mentioned.
And can I add
Yes,
to
Sofia.
What Stuart was saying? I think, the hybrid approach of like examining these models, but then also like, why do we need to rely on the most unexplainable kind of like maybe robust models that we can use? In, like you said, you mentioned, I'm talking to the audience, the patterns that we can find that we wouldn't be able to find, that the transformers could, for example, detect. Like, if we cannot explain these patterns and if they don't make sense, are they actually useful for us? Can we tie them to decision making? So a lot of unraveling of that, like I think a lot of like simpler models can show us more insights than maybe like a combination of like neural networks or any other kind of like deep learning algorithms can show us.
Thank you, Sofia. So I think that we're getting to the end of our panel time. And so I really wanted to thank all the panelists for taking the time to have this discussion. I think it was extremely rich and interesting. As you can see, you know, there are many people that are very passionate about this subject, and it's a very rich one. Sorry, I have a little visitor here. But I also want to thank the audience members for their very, very insightful questions. And I suggest that we share resources as well. So, you know, Navid or the other person who asked a question as well, who's working in this domain, to share some of the documentation, because I think that we would all really love to hear it. So thank you so much to everyone, and I will pass the microphone back to Ximena.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eleonore, Stuart, Robert, and Sofia for being here. And thank you guys and the audience for being here and, you know, joining also this panel online. We are going to be just closing the session for now, but just we're going to break now. Ah, look, the little one. You want to say something? No? Okay. So, so we're going to be closing today this panel.